It all started on a quiet Saturday morning at my lake cabin, the kind of peaceful spot folks dream about. My property had this small wooden bridge I built myself years ago, connecting the dock to a little island I'd cleared for fishing and bonfires. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Then out of nowhere, the HOA decided it was unsafe and unapproved. No warning, no letter. Just a work crew showing up with chainsaws, ripping through something I'd built with my own hands. And just like that, my bridge and years of memories were gone. Now, I've dealt with my fair share of HOA nonsense. Fines for the paint on my shed, complaints about a wind chime being too loud. But this was personal. I tried to talk to the board, but they brushed me off like I was nothing. Meanwhile, they sat smug in their million-dollar lakefront homes, sipping wine by the water's edge like nothing happened. That's when I found out something interesting, something they didn't want anyone to know. See, while they were so focused on controlling every inch of my property, they completely ignored a small oversight involving the lake's old drainage system, one that just so happened to run under my land. And once I dug a little deeper, no pun intended, realized I had the legal right to control the flow. So yeah, they took down my bridge. But they didn't expect what happened next, because I wasn't about to just let it slide. I didn't vandalize anything. I didn't break the law. I just exercised a right they forgot I had. And when I did, their prized $2 million lakefront started to look a whole lot less luxury. What happened next? Let's just say the board wasn't so smug after that. The thing is, I didn't move out here to pick fights. I bought that cabin years ago to get away from city stress, to have a quiet place by the water where I could fish, grill, and just breathe. The lake was peaceful back then, before the HOA took over. They came in promising community improvements, but what they really brought was a bunch of rules and power trips. Over time, they started telling folks what kind of deck chairs they could use, what plants they could grow, even how often they had to cut their grass. It went from a friendly lake neighborhood to some kind of gated kingdom. Now, the bridge I built wasn't bothering anyone. It was sturdy, small, and only on my side of the lake. But one of the board members, Doug, he always had it out for me. Real estate guy, drives a brand new boat, acts like he owns the whole shoreline. He once warned me at a meeting that I was too independent for a place like this, whatever that meant. So when the HOA suddenly decided my bridge was a hazard, I had a pretty good idea where that decision came from. After they tore it down, I went digging through old land records, just trying to figure out my options. That's when I stumbled onto something strange, an easement that ran right across my property from decades ago. And tied to that easement was access to the lake's original overflow valve. Back before the HOA developed the area, it was used to regulate water levels for farming. They must have assumed it was decommissioned or sealed up, but I went and found it myself. Still worked perfectly. And here's the kicker they'd built: their fancy shoreline additions without checking that history. The whole community rested on the idea that the lake would stay full. But suddenly, I was holding the key to all of it. At first, I didn't do anything drastic. I just stood there by that old metal valve, half buried in weeds and mud, thinking. The HOA thought they had me boxed in, that I'd just rebuild quietly or give up altogether. But the truth is, I was tired. Not just about the bridge, but about years of petty fines, threats of liens, and the feeling that I wasn't welcome on my own land. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought their money gave them control over everything and everyone. I started doing small tests. Turned the valve just a notch, barely enough to be noticed. Over a couple of days, the lake dropped just an inch or two. Nothing major, but enough that Doug's floating dock looked a little tilted. The board chalked it up to dry weather, played along, even joined the next HOA meeting over Zoom, just to watch them squirm as they tried to explain what was happening. That's when I noticed something else, a rift forming inside the board. Not everyone agreed with how Doug had handled the bridge. A couple of neighbors, especially an older couple named Bill and Marlene, reached out quietly to say they were on my side. Turns out, it wasn't the only one burned by the HOA. Another neighbor had been fined for planting a vegetable garden too, close to the path. Someone else got written up for having solar panels that didn't match the community aesthetic. People were fed up, but no one wanted to be the first to push back until now. Meanwhile, Doug was getting nervous. He hired a contractor to check his shoreline and even started patrolling the edge of the lake like he expected something to go wrong. But he still had no idea how close he really was to watching it all sink well. Drain right in front of him, by the second week, the waterline was visibly lower. Not enough to alarm everyone, but just enough that boats near the HOA's side started dragging a little in the mornings. You could hear the motors sputtering as folks tried to push off for their morning cruise. Doug was red-faced every time he passed my dock, but he still hadn't connected the dots. To him, I was just the quiet guy at the edge of the lake, nursing a busted bridge and some bruised pride. He had no clue how deep I was in the records, or how carefully I was turning that valve just a quarter turn at a time. Always late at night, always quiet. Then came the emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but Bill slipped me the notes afterward. Doug had gone full panic mode. He blamed the city's water department, demanded an inspection, and even accused a few residents of tampering with natural flow patterns, whatever that meant. But the kicker: he wanted to start fining people against just to show control. That backfired fast. Half the board pushed back, tired of being used as Doug's personal army. Marlene sent me a text later that night. He's losing grip. Keep going. Around the same time, a local news crew showed up to do a segment on shrinking lakes in the region. The board tried to keep them on the public side, where the shoreline looked cleaner and deeper. But I knew the old pathways, and I walked. The reporter threw the muddy banks near my land, showing him the dry cracks forming under Doug's fancy gazebo. I didn't say much, just enough to suggest things were changing. Naturally, legally, quietly. Then came the forecast. A dry spell, no rain for 2 weeks straight. The perfect setup. The lake, already dropping, was about to hit a point where the damage wouldn't be so easy to reverse. And Doug, he was finally starting to realize he didn't control the lake anymore, just when I thought I had the upper hand. Something unexpected happened that nearly threw the whole plan off track. One morning, as I was walking the path behind my property, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the old access trail, deep ones, too wide to be from any local ATV. I followed them carefully, heart pounding, until I found something that stopped me. Cold, a small stack of orange survey flags planted near the old overflow valve. Someone else had found it. Turns out the HOA had quietly hired a private environmental consultant. It's probably under Doug's orders, trying to investigate without alerting the rest of the board. They were planning something, and from the look of the markings, it wasn't just for observation. They were considering sealing the old valve off completely. Legally, they didn't have the authority without my permission, but Doug never played fair. I knew he'd find some loophole, some city connection, or maybe even push for an emergency ordinance that raised the stakes fast. I started getting anonymous calls in the evening, no caller ID, just silence, then hang-ups. My mailbox was knocked over one night. It's nothing major, but enough to let me know someone didn't like how things were turning. It wasn't paranoia. This was pressure. Real pressure. Meanwhile, the lake kept shrinking. Boat ramps were dry. The HOA's prized community dock was leaning like a sinking ship. But instead of backing down, Doug doubled down. He started telling neighbors I was behind the lake sabotage. I overheard him say at the store, "He's draining it out of spite." The smear campaign had begun. That's when Marlene dropped a bombshell. She found an old email chain from 2 years ago, one where Doug and another board member talked about rerouting part of the lake to raise their own shoreline values. If that email ever got out, it wouldn't just hurt Doug, it could unravel the entire HOA leadership. And now I had it in my hands. I knew the moment had come. With that email in hand, I printed a few copies, sealed them in envelopes, and quietly slipped them into the mailboxes of every board member. No note, no explanation, just the raw truth staring them in the face. I didn't have to say anything, okay? By that evening, I saw 3 board members pacing around the dock, arguing under their breath. Doug wasn't there. Word spread fast. The email outlined how Doug had pressured the board to approve a landscaping project that raised the shoreline near his home, even though it lowered water access for others. He even bragged about how property values would shift in his favor. It was all there: dates, names, approval signatures, within 48 hours. There was an emergency vote to remove Doug from the board. It passed unanimously. I didn't even have to attend. The same people who once looked past every one of his shady decisions were now scrambling to distance themselves. He showed up to my property later that week, alone, with a weak smile and a forced apology. Said it was just business and hoped we could move on. I didn't answer, just pointed toward the lake. His dry, cracked shoreline said more than I ever could. But here's where it takes one last unexpected turn. A city inspector showed up a few days later, saying there'd been a complaint about tampering with municipal water systems. Doug had filed it right before he was ousted. Classic move. But the thing is, I had already registered the old easement and valve system as a private water feature restoration project, legally permitted under a state conservation loophole. The inspector looked around, took some notes, and left without another word. The best part? The new board reached out asking if I'd consult on future lake management decisions. They even offered to help rebuild the bridge. I told them, maybe. But inside, I already knew I'd never let anyone control my land again. In the weeks that followed, the lake slowly began to recover. With the dry spell over and some light rain returning, I adjusted the valve back to a neutral flow. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Never really was. It was about making a point. That land, that cabin, and that lake had been my escape from noise and control. I just wanted to be left alone, to enjoy it in peace, the way it used to be. Doug eventually sold his place. Rumor was he took a loss on it. No one waved goodbye when the moving truck pulled out. The rest of the HOA board, now a bit humbler, started rebuilding relationships instead of walls. They dropped a bunch of pointless rules, invited folks to community meetings, and even set up a volunteer cleanup day for the lake. I didn't join, but I appreciated the effort. It was progress. As for me, I rebuilt the bridge, this time sturdier, with some help from Bill and Marlene. We laughed while putting the last boards down, thinking back on how a simple plank walkway caused all this chaos. Funny how something so small could shake the whole foundation of a so-called luxury lakefront community. I still keep the valve key locked away. Not as a threat, but as a reminder that you can stand up for yourself without breaking anything. That sometimes the quiet ones know more than they let on. And that just because someone wears a title or lives in a big house doesn't mean they know what's best for everyone. So, yeah, the HOA tore down my bridge. But in the end, they rebuilt more than they destroyed. And I got my peace back, along with a view no one can take away again.